I hope you can hear me. I have a kind of soft voice and I'm also not a native English speaker, but I will do my best not to come across as a Frenchman trying to speak English. I wish Rachel could continue because there's nobody better to speak than you, to be honest. But I will give it a go. I last minute changed a little bit the program of my speech today. I'm known to go on for at least 3 hours with one toilet break, and so we'll have to race today, and I will try to keep my mouth shut as much as possible on the subject of things, thought, theory, you might say, but I kind of dislike to separate it as theory. But thoughts around architecture, the nature of time, which has been my main obsession since I started working with film and photography. And in the margin of that, of course, the drawings. And so I've brought with me 6 works, of which I will highlight 3 and spend a little bit less time with the other 3. And I have Gillian, who's my dear remote control, who will do the steering. So, so I decided to kind of separate those 3. Architecture has been, mainly by chance, something that came back again and again. It started by a collection that I made for myself of reproductions of architectural photography some 20 years ago. I still don't know exactly why I did that, but I suppose I got fascinated with the presence of the human figure in front of a brand new, usually, building. And I thought about this type of photography as the wedding photographs of urbanization or of architecture. And of course, the composedness. I am a composer first and foremost. This is why I run Academy and why I spent a big part of my youth between my age 10 and age 23 drawing and painting, but mainly drawing. So composition has been very dear to me ever since. And I reluctantly started working with the moving images. I would have preferred to stay with photography all my life. It's kind of my biggest love. And you might notice that cinema is not my greatest passion. Although actually it's a bit of a love-hate relationship. So then the nature of time, paradoxically, what does time do in the moving image? In a context where it is always hyper-defined by 24, 25 or 30 frames per second, which if I remember well, Henri Bergson, through the mouth of Gilles Deleuze, said it's well, I can only say it in French, I believe. It's an instant privilégié combined or coming from an instant quelconque. So it's a special moment bathing in regular moments, in any moments. And so the mechanistic basis of the apparatus, of course, is in fact one terrible thing, because it only knows one pace, and that's these number of frames per second. And so I've unconsciously been working with this totalitarian aspect of time, the way we use it. And it's incredibly pervasive if you think about it, because nothing we do is disconnected from the clock. The screen has a certain refresh rate, the lights have. We spend so much time in this cage, which is a particular frame or a particular frame rate per second, that we can, we kind of naturally think of our own biologically lived time, but we're actually all the time directed, as a conductor does, through clock time. So if I were to sum up all that I've been doing, it would be trying to find holes, escape routes from this imprisonment of clock time. And some of you may know that there was a very famous debate, I believe it was in 1922, between Albert Einstein and Henri Bergson, in which Henri Bergson finally supposedly lost the debate. But maybe it's time to pick it up again and to see maybe Henri Bergson had a point after all. But I won't go into that very much because we don't have 3 hours. And then we come to the senses. Together with this atomization of time, we also seem to have divided the senses into separate chapters. The king of it being the eye, we call it ocular centrism. And there's a rich tradition of anti-ocular centrism. But I could say it's also probably what guides and directs politics nowadays more than before, is that whenever there's a camera, there's a chance for change. If there's no camera, it hasn't even happened. So it would seem that this mechanical eye that we all use so often is really on the top list there, followed by probably hearing, although in cinema, as we all know, hearing comes later, sound comes later. It begins with the image and they don't actually have a natural correlation with one another. And then, of course, the other senses kind of dangle somewhere there. And I've been trying to fight also against this enclosure, this boxing in of senses. And recently discovered with a big word, I'm an amateur, neuropsychology and the division of mind and body, which is one of these things that we should all fight. And I think artists have a tradition of fighting against this division. So I hope through the works it will become clear what this is all about. In the division of the senses, of course, I should maybe add that computing is an incredibly important chapter, but that will come. So we will start by a work which has been one of my early works from the year 2004. I made another one a year later, which was called White House, and which had a similar structure, but which was much more violent. The Bordeaux piece itself is a very simple, soft story about a father, his son, and the girlfriend of the son. And the father is a famous film producer and he tries to seduce the girlfriend of his son. So it's a tacky story, loosely based quite contemptively on Contempt of Jean-Luc Godard. And it lasts 13 hours and 43 minutes. It's about 75 short movies that look alike, but that are actually reenacted over the course of a full day, from sunrise to sunset, which makes that the actors become tired, they start making mistakes, and all kinds of contingencies enter into the film. The next piece will be Sunrise from 2009. It's a pitch black work. It's also projected on black, in a black room with 0 lux. So it's also a short movie. It's it's a kind of a record short film that I've made. It's only 18 minutes. And but it's kind of it's really kind of sensorial deprivation of the eye, one could say. And I think when your eyes are excluded, when there's too little light, then your ears go open and your other senses start to be heightened, and they work overtime to help. That's probably evolutionary reflex, but this is something that was in me in many works that I've done. So that's a pitch black work with a story of a young woman cleaning up the house of wealthy people who can afford to live in a minimalist, kind of Mies van der Rohe-like house. In reality, it's a house by Graham Phillips, who's a Norman Foster associate in London, just outside of London. And it has this wonderful paradox that much contemporary architecture has, is that it's also dominated by sight, and where the sense of hearing is obviously oppressed because it's right next to an airport. So, and it's incredibly photogenetic. It's very also very easy to film because it's all flat. So you can, it's kind of very handy to work in. And Graham Phillips was so generous to leave me and my team to work for a few weeks in his house. And I think he was probably, he let me do it more or less for free because I think he was fascinated with my question to film in pitch black or in darkness. Probably no one had ever asked him to use his house for that reason. A number of films have been shot in his house. And then we come, of course, to the Pas De Resistance Olympia, which is probably, conceptually at least, the longest work, the longest video piece ever made. We'll see how long it lasts. I guarantee the continuation of the work for my lifetime. So as long as I'm healthy, which is what, between 25 and 35 years from here, I will work on it and I will raise it as, I would say, the creator of Frankenstein, and you know, who has made a monster and then try to take care of it. Let's hope that what happens to Olympia will not be what happens to Frankenstein. It's a computer-generated work, as you can imagine. It's not a film, but it looks like a film, and I will elaborate a little bit more on it. Oh yeah, there are two versions of Olympia. There's a single-screen version, and so which is basically the biggest screen, and then there's a double-screen version, the way we have it installed here at Samstag. I should also mention that we have a 9.5-hour delay, which is something I, by principle, have not done yet, but it would have been a little bit too much of a pity to confront every spectator with a pitch black image, because it would be night. So we decided to, we made a piece of software which kind of gathers or which captures the film and delays it with 9.5 hours. It's a real-time work. It's also based upon real-time weather and decay of the Olympic Stadium. And we will end with a few works in brief. One of it, which is Wildfire. Wildfire, I wasn't sure if I was going to take it to Australia because I was afraid of getting rotten tomatoes thrown at my head. But I've been working on it since a few years, and it was a commissioned work, as is also many of the works that I've done on architecture, which were commissioned works. Don't ask me why, but it's just like that. It came out of conversations with people. In the case of Wildfire, it was a question from a curator on early Renaissance art who is commemorating Hans Memling, so the German-Flemish painter of the 15th century, an almost contemporary of Jan van Eyck, who's also being celebrated this year, and from whom there is an extraordinary exhibition running at the moment in Ghent, which probably will not be repeated. And I can only wholeheartedly recommend you to buy a very expensive ticket to Ghent and change it, because it's life-changing. It's so, you know, it leaves very little standing from Italian Renaissance art, with exception maybe of Piero della Francesca and a few others. It's quite staggering. And with that in the back of my mind, when I started working on Hans Memling, I had in my head these shapes in Van Eyck of Maria in the church. And she's like 15 meters tall. She's basically a building inside a building. And when I was thinking about what to do for this commemoration, I started thinking about the relation between fire and solidity or matter. Maybe not directly architecture, but somehow fire as a building, something through which you could walk through. And the film became a silent, almost silent meditation through fire as it consumes a group of trees. It's quite abstract work, although at the moment not. People told me that, yeah, it's of course very current, but of course I don't really care too much about that. What I care about, is it going to be current after we've all forgotten, hopefully, as soon as possible, about fire. Then there's the quiet shore, oil workers, and if I have the time I will speak a little bit about the piece that I'm making. And then there will be a few images on more or less the thought that I'm trying to develop. These books, I make 1 or 2 per month full of text and drawings, and so I have a few of those images there. So let's start with Bordeaux piece. You see here a collection of images. This shows you more or less the story. Nobody really cares about the story. It's kind of flat, and I love to trick people into thinking this is the work. But I'm not the greatest friend of narrative and of sequential narrative for that matter. What I'm looking for always is a shape of time that's more panoramic or broader or that has a certain volume. And you know that we're always struggling between the proportions between time and space because we have spatialized time. This is one of the greatest powers that we have throughout technology. We spatialize. So we have domesticated time, essentially, which means that time has gotten a certain shape. And most of my career is dedicated to breaking through that. So it's 13 hours and 43 minutes from sunrise to sunset. And this is the way it's sometimes installed. I love to do very simple installations. I don't regard my own work as video sculpture. That I think in our day and age, or at least from my personal perspective, doesn't make a lot of sense. I look at it as temporarily performed theater. Through technology, you can switch it on and off. Not anyone can switch it on and off, but you need specialists, but it's still something that is not too complicated. I love to project on transparent scrims so as to escape the darkroom or the black box and make out of the projector light something which resembles much more sunlight. So probably mimicking the sun altogether. There's a very nice a quote from Edvard Munch in his studio about artificial light, and it was publicity for infrared light, and it said, "Diese Sonne strahlt immer." This sun is always shining. Yeah. So that was the title for one of my exhibitions. The work itself was quite hard on the actors. Remember I said it's a long repetitive film. When we started early in the morning, from that point nobody in the team had a break until sunset. We spent about a month filming in the south of France or southeast of France in Bordeaux. The house is, you will see more about it, is a very well-known house by star architect Rem Koolhaas, who didn't like my piece. He's, I think, like many people who have attention disorder deficit, he ran through the work and said it looks like a fashion shoot, which is exactly, I think, what I wanted people to see who didn't pay attention. This is the same actor in a different scene with the girl, and basically everything is based on getting as good as possible shots of the light of day and the shadows that the trees cast onto the house and that the house cast on itself, or the shadows of the house. I was an early filmmaker at that time. I always work with amateurs. I kind of resist professionalization. That sometimes, generates compromises, but I live with that. So there's a lot of mistakes also in the recording of the sound, and there's a dog walking into the image at several occasions. There's the postman, there's even the owner of the house who forgot that there's a film team, and who runs into the camera early in the morning to make coffee. All these things, were part of the film. But unfortunately, the nicest parts are, of course, never seen in museums because, you know, museums are open from 11 to 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. And the more juicy bits are in early morning and in the later hours. This is the same, like the last shot we do. And I said, well, you know, that's weird. We have all these reflecting windows. For the last film, we will put the lights on. So we will reveal the mechanics of film. So there's the operator of the sound, there's me, there's everybody's in the film. Also that, sadly, nobody ever gets to see it. But I love these things that, you know, you need to take a bit of time for. It's always time as a certain resistance, yeah? Resistance to order, resistance to classification, etc. This is us performing in the afternoon. You can see how well organized the house is in relation to shadows. Huh? The shadows move very, very disciplinary from one side to the other, which is something that, of course, comes back many, many years later in Olympia, which this is something that Speer and co. knew how to do better than anyone else, is to domesticate light. So there's a lot of fatigue also in the team, because as you can imagine, the weather is not always blue and the sky is not always blue, unlike in Australia. We were there in a kind of wobbly weather. So there's a lot of clouds, but my film was playing in sunlight. So we gathered bits and pieces of the film, and in the end it became a race against the clock to run from one scene to the next and to build up the crane and whatever cameras and to shoot what we were still missing. It became a puzzle. So it was really physically very exhausting, which is something that I don't particularly like, but I think, you know, if you make art, you should want to sacrifice something for it. And physical sacrifice and labor are one of the few riches that artists have. They don't, you know, we don't have deadlines, and I don't like deadlines. I like to work for a long time. I am impatient, but in a way, works like these have been very good exercise in embracing a sense of labor and putting it into the work, not saying a word about it, unlike today, but then making people sense it over time, so over minutes. Exhausted actor. So of course you can imagine there's a lot of fighting going on behind the scenes because people get in bad humor. And then there's a sequence of images. So we don't have time to show the work. I hope one day it will be shown again. Artists also have always their, you know, latest work being performed and the oldest ones. It's like in families, you know, you always spend more attention to the younger kids. The story is very banal. It's this young man on the phone with his girlfriend, and he doesn't realize that she's actually kissing his father. And they don't know from one another that they're very close, and then he finds out, and then they have a discussion. It's all about composition. It's all about the movement of light, and I can assure you it's the best cure against insomnia. It's a kind of artificial way of finding back your biological clock. This is something that I'm very keen on. And then it ends more or less with him opening an anonymous letter that he received from his father. Something about, you know, a swimming scene in a movie with a naked girl or something like that, which is loosely stolen from Jean-Luc Godard. So then we come to the next work. So this is Sunrise. So that's many years later. Sunrise is in 2009, and that's this work which is pitch black until the very end of the film, where there's all of a sudden too much light in the room. And my spectators or my visitors have to adapt their eyes to the strength of the light, which is of course not true, because it's obviously a projection, and a projection has feeble light always. But somehow, again, in evolution, we are programmed to reflect or to have a reflex on strong light in relation to darkness. And obviously your eyes don't hurt when you see the light at the end of the movie. But there's a residue of it, and that's what matters. So it's the story about, and this will be very dark, we can try if you can see anything. That's a bit of the storyboard. It's a silent film. There is noise, but you hardly hear anything because this girl is working on her own. You can ask, why is she cleaning the house at night when there's no light? So she's basically preparing the house for the day, and it ends with the owners of the house waking up and switching on the light. Basically they go to the loo, they don't actually get up. She's making the coffee at the end, and then she's taking her bicycle. So it's just long enough to make your eyes adapt to the darkness. So I blew up the contrast in the image, and so you can see her doing all these composed choreography. It's like a dance, really. I didn't have much of a plan. Actually, I didn't have an actress when I went there. So I'd prepared everything, and I had an intern from London, and I asked her to do the job, and she became the actress. I'm really, really very bad with actors. And she does that. Well, it almost looks like daylight, and some of the scenes are shot in twilight. Some of the scenes are shot at night. There's of course the clock, and it was really a pleasure to shoot that film. It has sound at the end, and throughout my career, I've done a number of works, not many, that have sound. Because sound, as I said, the relation to image is problematic. One shouldn't take that for granted. But in this case, it's a short soundtrack of Rachmaninoff. It brings you to tears sometimes. It's very, very melancholic. But it's just at the end when she's done her work. There's not much going on, and so this is really an installation. You can't say it's a short movie because you couldn't play it on your screen. You have to project it on black. And the little bit of sound it has is also quite important. So and then she's putting up the table for breakfast, and she is then making the coffee. Here she's waiting for the coffee. The only thing that happens is we in real time make the water cooking, and then the whistle of the cooker is, it's all happening in real time. Then she takes her bicycle. This is exaggerated, it's not so light. Really only the first rays of sunlight come with the next image. And that's the moment when the music comes in. And this music comes in from kind of behind you. It's not very obvious. You're not sure if it's in the film or not. Could be somewhere else. And then she's disappearing. And I was thinking there are associations of beginning and end, of course. There's this thing with the light. Your eyes hurt a little bit. It doesn't. It's your mind that hurts, really. And then there's of course, it feels like a beginning, but on the other hand, the whole architecture looks like as if it's a piece buried in a museum, or presented in a vitrine of a museum, with very fragile conditions and with very little light. And I think I was probably thinking about this notion of modernity in architecture, and the composure of the human being in spaces like that, which are a thing of the past. So we go on to Olympia. Olympia was one of these crazy ideas, and I don't think an artist has ideas or chooses ideas. In my case, it's usually the idea that chooses me, and I often curse it. But also, it's also a little bit like an epiphany in a way. You're very happy for the next days to come when you have an idea. I think ideas are very rare. We don't often speak too much about how ideas are generated, because I think the reality is that they're very rare. You know, the older you get, the more seldom they become. It's a little bit like voices you would hear in your head, and according to Julian Jaynes, we have a consciousness that once upon a time looked completely different and was completely dominated by auditory hallucinations. With the ideas, it's similar. An artist needs to have a conversation with them and keep it alive. But keeping that conversation alive is not so easy. Because the more you know about what you do, the more you have a tendency of burying that stuff that you're trying to excavate. But Olympia is one of those fortunate and also unfortunate ideas, because as I said, I have to spend the rest of my life with it. I will give you a bit of insight in how I made it. This is the origin of the work. So you have these columns which have a particular discipline in their relation to light. This is not in the main oval place of the stadium. This is a little bit away from it, and it's not very well taken care of. The stadium itself is very well taken care of and has not a single weed growing. And as you can notice, this is exactly what I saw. I thought, wow, this is kind of magic. You can feel that the weeds that receive more sunlight grow a little bit higher than the ones that... So even, you know, Nazi Germany knew how to tame its weeds and how to get it organized as an army. So I set out to have sweet revenge in a computer simulation, which of course would last 1,000 years. I don't really have to explain, I hope, why I chose it to last 1,000 years. But this is the genesis of the work. And from there everything grew. So I started basically on the spot that day when I had the idea. I abandoned everything else I had planned, and I spent the next hours photographing. And from there we worked. So I looked at everything that, every little corner where weeds could grow. And I started looking at the north and the southern part of the building and the differences in growth of vegetation, all due to sunlight. And later I discovered that even this totalitarian, militaristic thinking had a relation to poetry. This is very awkward to say, but there is a kind of beauty in the relation of light and matter, so stones, which is unescapable, but you have to spend time with it. And I don't know if it's due to the architecture or due to the simple fact that life on Earth is cyclical and that morning comes after night. So this is a simulation already. We're starting to see in how far, so everything's done with textures. You more or less are aware, I think, of how 3D simulations are made. We scanned the building rather faithfully. All the stones shown on their geographical location. I did have a bit of an example through Chernobyl and Pripyat, because at that time we were we were commemorating 25 years of nuclear catastrophe in Ukraine. But that had for me as an advantage that I could study more or less exactly the growth of vegetation over the course of 25 years. Geographically, it's not the same situation, of course, with Berlin, but still, you know, we're talking about situations where there's a lot of concrete, hastily built places that are then abandoned, and it's a good study of what vegetation can do once it's unleashed and once it gets to grow by itself. So, just for illustration, this is how the stadium looked when it was opened in 1936. This is an acrylic painting, a study of light. I made many of those in trying to grasp or get a sense of the changes of light in the building. And then a study of winter. Before winter, before the work was ready, I had to kind of simulate how it would look like. And I do that then by drawing or by painting in this case, but I don't really like to work very much with color. Usually black and white is fine. That brings me to computing. So when I started working away from the camera and away from the lens and away from digital photography and image making into virtual image making, I started noticing a few weird things, a few side effects of what happens with yourself as an author. So when you have a camera and you spend time in an environment, you basically have three things. You have yourself, you're the author, but you're not entirely in control. You also have the light of day and many other things. And then you have the apparatus, the camera, and then you have that event which is unfolding in front of your camera. When you work in virtual image making, all of that is gone. You basically become a kind of god, but human beings are terrible gods. They always do half stories. Computers are much better in executing that, and I don't know, maybe we'll come to it, but later I found out, or I'm still finding out, that there's a very fascinating relation between the evolution of the brain and the reason why we work with computing so intensively. And of course, all the blah 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 about artificial intelligence, etc. But the more fascinating part of that is, I think, how artificial intelligent we become. So it's a two-directional process. So you basically calculate everything. And what you do in the calculation process is you throw overboard a number of very important things. In my case, that would have been vegetation, but I couldn't because vegetation became the main actor in Olympia. But of course, vegetation has been extremely reduced to a number of conversations that I had with biologists, architects, and matter experts. This is roughly the situation, the light from east to west, and then the northern part. And then there's an opening, which comes, I believe it's once every hour we pass by the opening. So it's an exact clock. You can put your clock to it, to the building. Also, like the Bordeaux piece, it's very good to fall asleep. It's so precise. And the sun goes up exactly where you expect it, even synced with the place it should have during winter and through the season, so the lower sun. It's extremely exact. That's, of course, the advantage that you have with computing, is that you can generate a poetry which is very precise also. And then these are some impressions of study of vegetation. What I did is basically, from the library, I got myself a few Bibles on biology or vegetation in Northern Europe, and I studied them. So I'm a very bad god who's reducing life to a number of things. Another scan of one of the sculpture groups. So we scanned it. It's not just filled in like a game, in a game engine. It's a little bit more faithful than that. This is how it's installed in another. This was Kunsthaus Bregenz, the building made by or designed by Peter Zumthor in Bregenz in Austria. And then these are some memories. We have a piece of software running in the software, which is gathering images every 5 minutes. So since the 15th of March 2016, which is when Frankenstein came to life, kind of coughing, but it's been kind of reliable also. It has been running. We've had snow on January the 18th, which was really nice because it was shown in Berlin. And so my simulation and the real thing were 8 kilometers away from one another. And people came to check me out, that's what they do. This is rain, so late in the evening in May. Oh, this is nice, maybe you can hold there for a sec. I said something about Nazi poetry. So you have light peering through this, that happens. But the strangest thing is, you know, people don't get to see it because at 8 o'clock in the evening, it's not open. It's still used for concerts and for football games, but then everybody's inside. They don't look at the periphery of the building. So they lock themselves and they're doing whatever they do. But these are things that I'm not sure if many people were aware of that kind of quality of light. You see that the logic of the army, so it's as if you have individual soldiers who only have a reason to exist when they're in the bigger body, namely the military. Fog at 9 o'clock in the morning, rain. You can see this is a year later, a lot has changed. This is all simulation, of course. I could intervene, but I tried to do as little as possible. In the background, you have Unité d'Habitation by Le Corbusier. And so I left it in because I thought this will disintegrate for sure faster than anything else. But I'm not sure, you know, I have no idea. I didn't work on it. I just let the model of it there. And it is in fact there, so it's kind of fateful. That must probably be night. Oh no, that's the end of it. So I have many more. I have thousands of those. And I hope one day to make a very boring book with all these images. Because that's the only memory that we have of the work. And then we come to Wildfire. Wildfire is this piece that will be approximately half an hour of study. I didn't make it because of the Australian bushfires. I also didn't make it because of the Californian bushfires, But I made it, why did I make it, or why am I making it? It's not finished. It's a premiere, so you're the first to see something of it. It's a simulation of fire, and it begins with a number of minutes of travel through a forest, or alongside the forest, sorry. Image quality is not too great. Mine will be much more precise than this. And it gradually changes into the red, violent light of reflection of fire. And then kind of abruptly it goes over to the full flame. It doesn't have sound, it practically has no sound. I'm trying to look for a certain latent violence without having it in sound. Sound would be too easy. Again, that's one of these things that are programmed in us human beings to be very effective. That's why you have cinema, of course, and good loudspeakers. But I kind of refuse to use that very often, or rarely. I'd rather have something very loud without any technology at all. Well, maybe you can still see it's a simulation, but I'm going to try to forward this manually. And it gets to this, so it has changed from daylight to night almost imperceptibly. And the next scene is the full explosion. And what I'm always fascinated with, including the other pieces that I'm going to show briefly, is how digital, what digital does to our nervous system. The more deeply we grow into it. And I guess everybody will agree that this is what's going on. Yeah. We say goodbye to an era of about 200 years of camera. And the camera as a confidence system, as a system, something to trust in, to believe that it's actually there, or that it happened, or that someone was there taking this picture or recording it. But we're losing it. And losing it is quite dramatic, because it's like, it's as if your family is gone. You have nobody else to talk to. They're all gone. It's disintegrating as we speak. And we have to replace it with something which definitely will be algorithmic or digital. But nobody knows exactly how to describe it or what it will be. But it's definitely having, as we speak, just like the camera did, an impact on our nervous system and on how we think about matter, and architecture for that matter. This is my flame, but you never get to see it this way. It's essentially, well, this is very rough. That's all work in progress. So it's basically a forest which is on fire. And the way it works is you need to determine all your parameters like you would when you play God. It's very dry or it's not so dry. It's pine trees. It's mainly pine trees in my film. It's a European situation. And it has I don't remember exactly, but the flames have been growing for like half an hour to an hour. And then you basically what you do when you get everything in place is you start a fire. It churns its way through data, and over the course of like a month and a half of calculating, you then more or less say stop, and that's your fire. So from there on, we have the fire as a building, as a 3D shape. There's a lot of possibilities about which intensity of the combustion that's happening. And I'm looking for a relation between this very temporal aspect of fire consuming matter and architecture, or I would say solid shapes. And my hope is that people who see the work will change their taste buds or whatever senses it is that they have active. From the beginning to the end, it will not be the same. So I'm hoping for a change in there. What it's going to be exactly, I don't know. This is Hans Memling, who was a master in, and for whom the piece has been commissioned. He was a master in bringing many stories together on a single surface. It's something that I've always find fascinating, how we human beings can make a journey on a flat surface and believe in it. So there's heaven, there's hell, there's the whole procedural thing of life and judgment, etc. It's very busy. This is a detail of hell and fire, but if you would go a little bit more up, you would see that beautiful blue sky is also there. And then this, of course, is Maria by Van Eyck. So you can see, did I say 15 meters? She's actually quite a bit higher, probably. This is incredible. In Ghent, they called their exhibition an optical revolution, which is a bit pretentious, but... And then these are some of my drawings. They look monumental, but they're very small. They're as big as this book, or a little bit bigger. This is essentially studies of smoke and fire. I didn't realize when I started this series of drawings that I was working with water, and I was basically carving fire out of water. And it became some kind of addiction. I've made some 30 drawings of it over the past winter. So then this is, here we stop for a moment, that's again Hans Memling. It's amazing, these encounters that you get sometimes between contemporary technology and old technology. I mean, Memling and Van Eyck were really masters in observation and in optics, in optical aids also. You can see in the armor, you can see the whole scene. It's kind of rare that you see Maria and the family portrayed in a wide open field with, I think this is St. John, and reflected really faithfully in a mirror, a concave mirror. It just takes your breath away when you see that. And next to it is, this is my method. This is the way we capture light. It's wrongly written, it's HDRI, not HRDI. Mirror, this is a way that we use, a manner that we use to capture environment light. We basically take pictures of that and of the environment and then project them back onto the 3D model. This is how you work. And you know what's so fascinating with 3D virtual image making is that it uses procedures which are quasi-identical to how the brain processes visual information. It's kind of fascinating. I don't know if much has been written about it, but my approach to it is of course never scientific, it's always that of an artist. But that was present already in the 15th century, for sure. Yeah. Well, this is my storyboard, ladies and gentlemen. That's how complicated my storyboard is for Wildfire. It's an idyll, then it's a lake. It's what we call a green wall of trees. Then it comes to small trees, and then we cut over to the red wall. We come to a scene which is very baroque, because that's obviously what fire is about. And then we come to smoke, and then to a scene which is deep hell, and then basically, imperceptibly we go back to idyll. I don't like loops very much, because I think loops are a sign of the neurotic, repetitive, compulsive disorder. And so I'm glad we live in digital age where we can at least have the simulation of ongoing time. These are my actors in Wildfire. These are some impressions of the work. So some work in progress. There was another side effect of it is that my technicians said I'm going to put my computer system on fire while rendering this. We have a group of 50 computers, and this is an ongoing project. We're heating the studio. Well, you know, in Northern Europe you need to heat. In wintertime we heat the studio, so we're also trying to render only in wintertime. But that's then in one of the scenes which we call the Baroque scene. This takes very long. This scene alone takes about 7 or 8 minutes. So that's going to be another test for people. So a quick word, I was speaking about matter, about digital matter. The Quiet Shore, it dates back to 2011, it's a bit of a, on crossroads. It's about water and about a sunny day with people on a beach. This is installed at the Secession in Vienna on a mirrored surface. It's quite a monumental projection. To the right you can see again our annoying actor in Bordeaux piece. And then a few impressions. So what it is, it's a succession of slides, digital slides, and basically the film behaves like, how shall I say, the film is as still as a mirror. It's as quiet as a mirror. And if you look to the left, you have actually one of the origins of modern movie making is, there's a house. It looks a little bit like the house in Psycho, by Hitchcock, and that's because it is the house in Psycho. So this is one of the shortest distances that you can go to England. So Hitchcock was known to go on holidays there and saw that house. The people who commissioned the work were actually, they wanted me to do something about one of the houses because they had seen that I'd done more work in architecture. But I became fascinated with the beach because it has these extreme low and high tides, and the sand is always silvery. It's got this incredible quality. It never dries up. And this is what gave me the idea of working with perfect mirror situation, so a quiet shore. Now, it's about half an hour, and it kind of relaxes you into a situation where you accept the anomaly of a sea which is completely quiet. And it goes on and it goes on, and if you're a disciplined visitor, then you come to the end of the film, And slowly we are creeping up to a little fellow here. And so I have to explain this to you because I can't make you feel it. By the time we get here, after half an hour, is this one little figure, a little boy, he's splashing, he's actually breaking the image. By the time you hear, this no longer feels like a situation in warm summer weather with water by the sea. It feels like glass or crystal or ice. So it's a simple way of making something transformative without any effort. Well, there's a lot of work, but without any explanations, and having a transition from warm to cool or cold, or from liquid to a different state. A brief word on oil workers, which is more or less exactly the same thing. It's based upon a found image of Nigerian men caught under a bridge because of heavy rain. And I thought, I was fascinated with the title, which I just stole from the internet together with the image. It was a bit different, but it said the oil workers, and it was a piece about, or it was an image about water. And I thought, and so that caught my attention. So I simulated it, and what I did is there's a camera travel throughout. It's like an elliptical camera travel, a little bit like in Olympia. And the first impression is that of water, but it changes into something sticky, something much more synthetic. And I love to work with narrative in the sense that I like to find the shadow part of a narrative. And you could read, of course, there's always a certain political hint, but I think there's way too much of that, and I always try to approach that via the periphery somehow of the image. And then that's the storyboard of the next piece that we're starting in April, which doesn't have a title yet, but it will be about, it will actually be a very condensed story of the camera in not even 10 minutes. And the main actor is a little boy. It's based upon found footage of the 1920s of a few kids which are playing in the street. It's a mute film, it has no sound. And there's this little fellow who's running in and out of the image, of the frame. And then there's this amateur cinematographer who's basically, as many cinematographers did at that time, they put a tripod and they let their film running, and that's how you get these cityscapes of that time. It was very popular subject matter. So it has no sound until the very end, when someone hands over a weird present to the child, and the film kind of like you would have in early days, the machinery or the mechanism would get stuck, and the film would stop. And I want people who see the installation to think that it's my work that's broken, and maybe start to look whether they should leave or whether the pause button has been pushed or something like that. And kind of imperceptibly, there's a transition from the found footage, the 35mm footage, towards actually a very precise digital simulation of that child. And it's again another transition from analog to digital, but to really radical digital, where up to a point you ask yourself, is this child that I'm looking at still this creature of flesh and blood, or is it a zombie? And is, despite all the faithfulness in the depiction, has life been vacated from that child? So it's something we need to get to terms with, I believe, in the next generations. But this is quite far off of what the film will be like. To end with a few impressions of the stuff that what I do when I read, I also write on the camera. So the word origin chamber, comrades, and camera. It's a place where you are together, where you are confident that what you see is original light and light that others have seen before you. And so you can relate to it. It's part of a family system. Yeah? And it's, so what happens in our time is a little bit what happens when you lose your sanity. I'm exaggerating, of course, because we will find a new confidence system, I'm sure. But it's a disintegrating system, and so that this kind of beautiful relation that we have with between our eye as a camera. So it literally looks like the body of a camera with the retina and with the shutter system. But actually, when you study the way the brain processes images, you realize that the eye has nothing to do with the camera. It has got much more to do with a digital camera, for that matter. And slowly but certainly you realize that we don't see with our eyes, but we see mainly through memory. But that's for another talk by someone who's much more expert than I am. And then, of course, there's virtual image making. I try to reflect a lot on the Cartesian or the Euclidean coordinate system X, Y, Z. The moment you get into virtual image making, you no longer are married to the kind of liberal thing of the camera, which could capture any situation on the planet. But you give to every situation, you give an address. Nothing comes by itself. Everything is provoked and thought through. And that brings me to the field, important divided attention. So we are creatures who, we have two eyes for a reason, and we have a split brain for a reason, is that we need to pay attention throughout evolution to the foreground and the distance at the same time, like all mammals of a certain size. And I kind of dream that abstraction in art is something that comes in modernity because we don't need to look at the distance so urgently anymore. We have the camera to do that for us. So we have the lens and a telescope to do that for us, which I think might have generated abstract art. And abstract art is a celebration of proximity and of matter on the plane, on the field. Of course, the brain. Oh, I recently had a kind of nasty encounter with a neuroscientist, and there I realized that clinical psychology is really very separated field from neuroscience. And these people often don't speak to one another. Oh yeah, that's more about the flatness of the image. I developed a concept which is loosely titled dark optics, which is about the image after light optics. It's concept, conversation, and consensus. So you have an idea, you speak about it, and you come with something. And consensus is, of course, also compromise. And then this is for Simon and Anna Hackett. This is about the internet. This is what I do, during my coffee breaks. Is I try to reflect upon cloud computing and the hell, and so I realized that actually the concept of hell and heaven still exists, and that cloud computing is actually a very hot enterprise. So. There's also a lot of cables buried underground, which you can see in the next image. So these are the residues of the internet in earlier times, and these are cables, but they're still buried and they actually look alike. And I think we can stop it there. Thank you.